Hello and welcome. My name is Melanie Ross, and I will be the facilitator of our webinar today. Our presenters are Dr. Vijay Krishna and Keith Mowry. Thank you for joining ANAB for our complimentary webinar on an update on the revision of ISO IEC 17020-2012. This is the wrong presentation. I'm on the wrong presentation, right? It says 17020, but it should be 17024, the committee draft ballot. Please note that we are recording this webinar, so it will be available for viewing in the future. Some logistics before we get started. Due to the high attendance, everyone will remain muted for the duration of the webinar. Please enter your questions into the Q&A box. We have planned time at the end of the webinar to answer your questions asked. About our presenters, Dr. Krishna is Vice President of Credentialing at ANAB. He is an IAF expert to ISO CASCO Working Group 30, revising ISO IEC 17024. Vijay has been an active participant in the Working Group 30 meetings to date. Keith Mowry is our Senior Manager Business Development at ANAB. He is ANAB's representative on the ANSI International Conformity Assessment Committee, or ICAC, the National Mirror Committee to ISO CASCO. He served as ICAC chair for over 20 years and has over 30 years experience with ISO standards and guides for conformity assessment. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Keith to begin the webinar.
Thanks so much, Melanie. And I have to say that the senior part of my title is particularly applicable because I'm the one who made the mistake on the title of the webinar slide. I guess that was part of my seniorness. This is certainly about CD 17024, and I just want to take a couple of minutes up front here to kind of put in context where this CD ballot sits. So there are 6 stages of ISO standards development for either a new or a revised standard. And the first and the last stage, the proposal and the publication, they're kind of common sense. The proposal stage is, should we develop a standard? Should we revise a standard? And then the last stage, the publication stage, is let's do all the cleanup and editorial and editing and actually print it out and publish it and sell it. So, but the real meat of the process is the 4 stages in between. And the ISO directives give names to these different stages: preparatory, committee, inquiry, and approval. But almost nobody uses those for the names of the stages. Rather, most people refer to each stage by the type of document that is considered within the stage, right? So the preparatory stage is usually more commonly referred to as the working draft stage because it's a working draft that's considered in the stage. And the next stage is usually the CD or committee draft stage. The third is the DIS or Draft International Standard stage. And the last before publication is the FDIS, or the Final Draft International Standard phase. So it's interesting to note that per the directives, there are only 3 stages that are actually mandatory to be used. The proposal and the publication, that makes sense, why those would be mandatory. But in between, it's only the Draft International Standard stage that's actually mandatory. It is possible to develop or revise an ISO standard with just that one DIS stage. Now, within ISO CASCO, it's really common now that the 3 of the 4 stages are used to develop or revise a standard. The working draft stage, committee draft stage, CD stage, and the DIS stage. And so it's for probably 4 or 5 years now, this has been the kind of the normal pattern that's been followed. So for 17024, ISO CASCO created Working Group 30 in late 2022 after CASCO members had voted to revise 17024 in the middle of that year. And so the vote to revise 17024, that completed the proposal stage. After Working Group 30 was formed, then the member bodies appointed experts, individuals, to populate the working group, 3 max per each member body of CASCO, and also the liaisons to CASCO named experts to participate. And that started, the naming of those experts started the working draft stage. And then, of course, within their meetings, Working Group 30 developed and considered working draft revisions to 17024. And when they had a working draft that they felt was suitable, they ended their working draft stage. And as of October 1st, they issued a ballot, which started the CD or committee draft stage. So there is an open ballot right now for the CD committee draft of revisions to 17024, and that is what Vijay is going to talk to us about, some of those revisions and how they compare with the currently published 17024. So I am going to hand it over to Vijay.
Okay, thanks, Keith. Thanks, Melanie. Thanks, everyone, for joining this webinar. In terms of looking at proposed changes, the reason I say proposed is all of these are going through the ISO process. But I do expect these to stay, but at this time, I would still like to call them as proposed. So in terms of looking at what are the areas where we are seeing major revision to ISO 17024? And to me, it seems there is one big area, which is in terms of use of AI in certification of persons. Now, if you look at 17024, this standard is unique in the sense that it has requirements for scheme development under Clause 8, which was one of the major contributions that came out of the last edition of the standard. So when the standard was revised in 2012, the major addition was Clause 8. And I see this to be analogous to that. And it's my understanding that this would be the first standard in the 17,000 series, which has specific requirements for use of AI in certification of persons. AI is used across disciplines, sectors, across standards, and it would be interesting how other standards mimic what's happening in 17024 or adopt some of these practices. So in terms of what this revision looks like at this time, when the committee was looking, very interesting in terms of looking at what is AI in itself. We spent a lot of time looking at how to define AI. And interestingly, there were many definitions of AI, including many definitions in the ISO scheme of standards itself. The one that the committee thought was most relevant, specifically to certification of persons, was this definition, where AI is the data processing systems that perform functions normally associated with human intelligence, such as reasoning, learning, and self-improvement. So when we use the word AI here, it's things that we would normally have people do it, persons do it, like subject matter experts, exam development committees, people who do things associated with the various activities relating to certification. So that's the definition, and you can look at the source from where it's coming from. Now, when I look in terms of how this relates to what we have seen within the United States specifically, we surveyed ANAB's accredited clients during the client day meeting to get a sense of how many CBs are using AI, what kind of activities, and what we see the potential barriers. And you can read more about it on the ANAB blog. It was a small sample size. We had 31 CBs that responded to a very simple set of questions. And this was more in terms of getting a sense of what's happening currently. What we found was about 50% of the respondents were using AI in some capacity. And to me, it would seem almost like tinkering with AI. trying to find out what are the touch points within the certification activities within the process where AI could be used. Interestingly, 3/4 of them, they said when it comes to actual usage, it's less than 5% of their activities. Rightly so, because as we know, AI is still coming out relatively new. So it's not that CBs are extensively using AI or have adopted the AI technology. Most of the activities for which the CBs were using was more for administrative tasks, very, very routine tasks, and some other areas where the CBs reported using AI was in terms of item writing. That was the most predominant area. A little bit about job analysis and remote proctoring. Again, in each of these areas, it was not that AI was independently writing items or AI was independently doing a job analysis or remote proctoring. What was being done is AI was used as a foundation, a starting place. Let's see in terms of item writing. Can we have one of these AI platforms help us with item writing? And then taking it to the subject matter experts and they working on those exam item writing. Similarly for job analysis, it was not a standalone activity, and I don't want you to walk away with this impression that, oh, we have now these CBs using AI for doing a job analysis. No, that's not the case. It's just getting started in terms of some of the basic work, pre-work to expedite the other activities or other steps in the process. For instance, if a typical exam item writing takes 1 day, can we have a draft that would help the committee to speed up the process? So again, it's not AI independently acting. Again, you can read more about this at the ANSI blog. Now, this is really important in terms of what are the challenges in the use of AI. Test security, certainly it's a huge issue. Copyright protection, concerns about information being fed into AI as training data. And all of us at different levels of our understanding based on our expertise are aware that when you feed in data into an AI model, there is, unless it's a locked down system, that information could be used as training data. So how do you make sure that that is not compromising your copyrighted exams, copyrighted book of knowledge, expertise that you have developed in-house? Accuracy certainly was an important challenge that was identified. Interestingly, folks also talked about lack of knowledge about how to use AI. We saw within the CBs that had responded different levels of understanding of use and implementation. There were CBs as expected in the cyber area, IT area that were using more than in areas where traditionally not much of technology is involved for the creation or development of certification, and the subject matter experts, people in the industry, are not as tech savvy as they would be if they were in an industry that is tech savvy. There were also questions about acceptance by ANAB, like if we did this, if we used AI for exam development, if we used AI for job analysis, what that would mean to our accreditation. So all of these things, and then I just wanted to pepper a little bit of humor. So I was using ChatGPT to create images for the presentation, and then I queued in, create an image of use of AI in certification of persons. And when this image came out, it said AI in personnel certification, personnel, P-E-R-S-O-N-A-O-L versus personnel that we use. And then it said biomental certification. I have not come across the word biomental certification. I have heard of biometrics, which I thought was interesting, which to me, the reason I put it out was to highlight that, accuracy and the stage at which AI is at this time needs very, very careful review by humans. In this case, if I didn't notice this, I would think, oh, personnel is correctly spelled. I would think it's biomental, which I know it's not because I know these terms. So it just highlights the need to be vigilant and careful in terms of how we use AI, which then ties into the revision. The reason I stated these points was to highlight what we are seeing in the industry, what are the concerns, what are the challenges, and how some of these could be potentially addressed through the proposed requirements in the standard. Now, I'm just going to be highlighting or talking a little bit about the bigger constructs. I'm not at this time spelling out the specific requirements that are there in the CD version of the standard, so that you understand what the direction is going to be and how you would be able to leverage AI, and especially if you are accredited or if you are seeking to be accredited and you want to use AI, what are the requirements that you would be staring at when this new revision comes out. So the first requirement would be the requirement for validation. AI technology that SCV uses needs to be validated, managed, and monitored. And before I elaborate this, one of the things that I want to reiterate is that there is no requirement in the revised standard to use AI, just like there is no requirement, for instance, to use a practical examination. So if you use it, then you would have to make sure that you have to follow these requirements. Just like there is no requirement for you to translate the test in other languages. But if you translate your exam, then you have to do it the right way. There are established requirements for test translation. So if you use AI, then you have to make sure that it is validated. Now, I'm not really going to be going specifically in terms of what are the ways to validate, manage, monitor. You can look forward to more detailed webinars that and training that ANAB will put out once the standard is revised, where we will talk about each of these, what would be the evidence that would be required to meet each of these requirements. But I just wanted to lay out a general flavor as to what these constructs mean. So essentially, validated would mean that you have evidence to show that what you are trying or what you're using AI for is essentially done by AI. And what that means is if you say that the AI platform that I'm using can write or can translate the exam accurately, right? So that's the claim that you're making. In that case, you would have to have evidence to support that claim. So the technology would have to be validated, managed, and then appropriately monitored. Again, very, very broad constructs, but I just wanted to make you aware that you need to start thinking, if you're using or intend to use, what that validation would look like for the specific task, specific certification activities that you're looking for. The next requirement, which again ties into what I showed you as part of our survey, competence of personnel. So if you are using AI, you have to make sure that you have people who have the competence to use AI effectively. And again, the standard use the word personnel. Personnel is a bigger term. It's not employees. It could be volunteers. It could be contracted people that are part of the certification that a body is involved with. You have to make sure that if you're using for certain activities, it's done under the supervision of people who have the competence to be able to show that they can do. And it's no different from what currently happens in other areas. So for instance, if you do an internal audit, you have to make sure that the internal auditor has the competence to do an internal audit. So you would not essentially have someone on the streets come and say, hey, like, you know, can you come and do an internal audit for us? So similarly, when you use AI, you would have to make sure that the person who is involved has the expertise, competence to be able to do that. It would also require that you have evidence to show that it is fair, which is again a very important construct. AI is not discriminating negatively against certain population groups, people from certain regions based on demographics, gender orientations, language, and all of the things that typically you are required to do when you administer your tests. So you typically are required to show your exam through various psychometric evidence is performing fairly across population groups. You would have to essentially start looking at that if you use AI. And this is specifically very, very important at this time because AI is being developed and a lot of models that are currently being used, being developed, have training data come from very specific regions of the world, particularly North America, United States, Western Europe, not so much from Africa or not so much from developing Asian economies. So it's really important that you have to make sure that issue of fairness, valid, reliability would be consistent. So if you are, for instance, writing exam questions, say, you know, you want to create exam questions based on an FDA food code, you develop that, and then you find that the type of responses are not consistent, or the type of questions that are being generated. You can also look at one of the blogs that I wrote in terms of lockdown systems, which is very, very interesting, which will talk about some of these issues. But here again, broadly fair, valid, and reliable, these terms should not be new to people who have been accredited by ANAB. It's used extensively when you do psychometrics. So, the other area where this would come into play would be human oversight, which is different from competence of personnel. So you need to have someone who's competent, but you also need to have human oversight. The standard is not envisioning an AI system that does everything on its own. So one of the analogies that I can think of is at this time, think of it as you have an autonomous car which drives on its own with zero human interactions or human driver, versus you have someone who is sitting and is supervising, can take over the wheels, can control if something were to go wrong. So human oversight, it's really one of the critical components. In any aspects, anything that you intend to use AI, you have to show that there is an overarching human oversight that makes sure that things are done based on the established protocols. Again, the note provides additional information regarding human oversight. What does it mean? How does it look like? What are the safeguards and elements associated with that? This requirement is going to be interesting, and to an extent, it will require you to relook at some of your public-facing documents from your website, candidate handbook, in terms of disclosing use of AI. So if you use AI, there would be a requirement for disclosure. I'm not going to go down in terms of what that disclosure language would look like. What does that really mean in terms of disclosing? Would it be enough to say, oh, we use AI for certification activities, or would there be need to specify what does that look like? But at this time, it's sufficient to say that if a CB, a conformity assessment body, certification body for person, uses AI, there would be requirements for disclosure. Again, requirement for acknowledgement. And the committee deliberated whether it should be consent or acknowledgement. Now, there is a difference between these two terms. Acknowledgement would mean that an applicant would say, okay, I understand as a CB you use and I acknowledge the use, versus consent would be more in terms of a legal binding and saying, okay, I consent to use of this. Now, these are some of the requirements language that will be in the standard, but for each of you as a certification body, it would be absolutely important for you to have some of these language in terms of disclosure, consent, acknowledgement, agreement, that you would need to have your legal team be involved, because it's going to have legal implications. Just like some certification bodies, when you use data forensic, you have language in your candidate agreement where the applicant consents for you to use forensics in that case, and then if some additional actions are required. So this would be, you can always do things that's more than what the standard says, but you would not be allowed to do things that is less than what the standard says. So at this time, the revision would look like requirement for disclosure and requirement for obtaining acknowledgement. Now, these are the, so this would be a new section using of AI. Now, there would be other minor changes. So you're going to see a little bit, the look of the standard is going to be different. We spent a lot of time looking at the definitions. Some of the definitions have been improved upon, primarily based on how the words have played out over the years. And then also making sure that the words that are defined in the standard translate well and make sense globally. And this is very, very important for ISO specifically, because the standard is translated, and some specific words in English does not translate well in other languages. So all of these had to be relooked, the structure, common elements. So all of that, in my understanding, is going to enrich the standard. We have tried to bring in the learnings over the past 10 years in terms of some of these words, terminology, how best to make sure that there is more clarity in terms of defining some of these elements. You'll also see some rewording of a few clauses to make sure that these are precise. It reflects what the authors had in their mind when they were writing these requirements, and that's what we have done as authors of these the standard, making sure that the rewording captures the intent that we have in place. For instance, the word risk and threat, it's used different in the ISO terminology and lexicograph. So we wanted to make sure that we use the word risk where it was appropriate. When ISO used the word risk, it has both positive and negative connotations. So risk is not necessarily negative. It can have a positive spin, positive implication, whereas threat would be more negative. And more specifically, when we look at threats within the context of certification of person, it's in terms of independence, impartial assessment, whether someone has the competence to practice. So some of these rewordings you will see within the text of the standard. You will also see alignment with ISO language. So ISO has a suite of standards. People typically refer to that within the 17,000 series, 17,065, and these are all ISO CASCO standards for conformity assessment. And the reason for alignment of these common language is to make sure that for the requirements that are same or similar, say for instance for management system, it looks and feels the same across these different 17,000 standards. And one of the main reasons is why make it look different if it is the same. And we have gaps that have been accredited under multiple standards. So if you are accredited under 17024 and 65, 67, you want to make sure that the common elements are more or less aligned, which makes it easier for gaps that are accredited under multiple 17,000 series standards. So you will see that. And also sensitivity to gender issues, sensitivity to accommodation issues. And as some of these words evolve, language is fluid, dynamic, constantly evolving. So when words are refined upon and there is sensitivity with some of these words, they get reflected in a standard. So for instance, the word disability replaced with special accommodation versus specific accommodation request. So some of these, I don't see them as a major change, but it is just refinement in terms of the language, given the sensitivity that ISO shows towards use of some of these terminologies. The last I want to talk about this infographics that Dr. Cynthia Woodley and I had worked upon many years back. And interestingly, it started with the difference between examination and assessment. So when this started was, okay, how can we visually define examination different from an assessment? So when you look at examination, it's written, oral, practical, observation. So this is how the exam is defined. When we use the word assessment, assessment is a bigger construct that includes examination. So it could be assessment of your eligibility requirements, assessment of your application to make sure that you meet the requirements in order to take the examination or an assessment. Now, in some cases, if a certification body only has an examination, so there is an application and an examination, that's all there is. Let's assume that it's an examination. In that case, the examination and the assessment would be the same. There would not be any difference. But if a CB has a set of eligibility requirements, examination, and in some cases, plus other requirements before someone can be granted a certification, it could be education, it could be training, it could be experience. So there are other requirements in addition to passing the examination. So in that case, exam would be different from assessment. Now, when we look at the word certification scheme, it includes examination, assessment. It also looks at what's the scope of the certification. What is it that someone who has a specific certification can do and not do, what are the boundaries within this person needs to operate, which is really, really important. So for instance, if you're a fitness trainer, what are your boundaries within which person can operate as defined in the certification scheme? Job task analysis to develop those competence requirements. Essentially, that's deconstructing the job abilities, if applicable, prerequisites. So what this essentially, when we talk about the certification scheme, it is not just the job analysis, it's not just the exam blueprint. It looks at all of these elements that fall under these set of requirements as listed in this, plus alignment between assessment and or examination. How does the assessment or examination measure the requirements in the scheme so that the person has those competence requirements as to practice? When you look at certification process, it includes the process for all of these, the exam process, the assessment process, the process to do a job analysis, the process to grant certification, process to issue certificates. So all of that is part of the certification process. And when you look at your certification activities, in addition to each of these, in addition to the examination, assessment, scheme, process, it also includes administrative activities, test security, confidentiality, complaints and appeals, personal competence, personal training, records, as well as outsourcing. So it's a very nice visual graphs, and people who have used this have found it very, very useful. At this time, it looks like this graphics would be included in the standard. So at this time, the CD, the draft standard has this visual infographics embedded within it, which I think will help people who are not clear in terms of some of these concepts to have a more visual understanding. Many people, when it's put in visually, it's a lot more easier to understand versus a lot of words. A picture can be worth 1,000 words. So this would be in the standard, and probably it'll help people visualize the requirements, understand these differences. So in a nutshell, when you look at where we are in terms of revision to the standard, and this is my own understanding, that the big major change would be use of AI, lots of minor refinements, changes in definitions, changes in terms of the structure and appeal of the standard, the infographics that adds added clarity. But I don't see that this is going to be something which would be met with resistance, or it would be seen as significantly different, or disrupts what a certification body currently is doing. So even if you look at the requirements for use of AI, if a CB is not using AI, does not want to use AI, then that's fine. So essentially, in that case, the major change would not really impact SCB. But as we start using AI, and I would imagine everyone at some point is going to start using AI, because the AI platforms are now getting integrated in a lot of things which historically we would not think of them as AI. So even when you do any test translation or translation, Google Translation, using various types of word editors, search engines, even right now when you use some of the search engines, you get an AI summary of what the question that you have typed. So I would think more CBs, whether they're aware or not, they would start using more and more of the technology, especially as it gets more mature, and some of these requirements should play an important role in terms of public protection, in terms of ensuring transparency, in terms of ensuring fairness, reliability, and validity, so that there is evidence to support in case there is any challenge, in case there is something that needs to be held legally defensible. So that's all I have, and I will turn it over to Keith for the remaining part of this webinar.
Well, thanks so much, Vijay. And I guess I'll just close briefly with now where the process goes from here. We've talked about, before Vijay's very enlightened comments, we kind of set the stage of where we are in the process. So where does the process go from here? And what we see here is a chart that was, I believe, produced by the working group. And each of the blue dots on this chart are discrete working group activities. And in between the blue dots, there would be things like ballots and feedback that would be delivered by CASCO member bodies and liaisons. And this is pretty typical. This is a pretty typical look ahead at what the path that CASCO usually follows. I will point your attention, however, to the word if. It's under December 2025. There's an if. It's under January 2026. There's an if. And as a matter of fact, there are actually other ifs that are built into this process that aren't stated, but that I want to go over just briefly so that you have some context about what might be coming next. So the CD ballot, the CD draft that's out now, comments will be collected. And on a CD ballot, the only thing that CASCO member bodies and liaisons are asked for are comments, just comments. There's no vote to approve or disapprove. As a matter of fact, the ISO directives say that the CD stage, the committee draft stage, is the principal stage where comments from national member bodies are considered. So the working group 30, will look at all the comments that are submitted, and they will take a decision on what to do with literally each comment, whether to accept the comment and change the draft, or decide that it is not persuasive, or that it's addressed by some other means. And then they'll have a decision to make. After they consider all the comments and they make the changes to the draft, they're going to look at the new draft after the CD comments, and they're going to compare it to the draft that was balloted. And if the working group decides that this new draft, after they've made the changes from the comments, is so remarkably different that they really feel they need to get the national member bodies to look at it again at the CD stage, they can issue a second CD ballot, a CD2, and the whole process would just repeat, and that ballot would be issued to the member bodies, and the member bodies would have a chance to submit their comments. Now, that would happen probably first or second quarter of next year, but admittedly, that is very uncommon in CASCO. Not quite as uncommon as a vote to disapprove. That's really uncommon. But a second CD ballot is not very common. And as Vijay mentioned, it's probably not likely that that's going to happen. So in that case, if the working group looks at this new draft they've produced and they say, okay, well, there's some changes, but there's nothing really, remarkably different, nothing that really would be a big change for the people in this field, then they could reach the agreement, or their decision could be, let's move this on to the next stage, the DIS stage, the draft international standard stage. That's much more likely what the next stage will be, and that again would happen in the first or second quarter of next year. Now, the interesting thing about the DIS stage is that this is the place where there's a vote, right? The ISO CASCO member bodies actually now vote to approve or disapprove the draft international standard that they are looking at. But as I mentioned before, CASCO ballots on revisions of documents literally always are approved. In my 30 years of experience, I've only seen one ballot to revise a standard that has been disapproved in all those years. And so this introduces a bit of a conundrum, or a difficulty for the working group. So they get a draft international standard ballot. They send out the draft international standard, and almost every time it comes back approved. It also comes back with comments. And so the working group has to think about, well, the draft was approved, which means the majority of the CASCO member bodies thought it was ready for the next stage, and yet we have these comments. And sometimes the vote to approve the draft international standard can be used as a rationale to not really want to make too many changes to the draft international standard as a result of the comments that were submitted. So in other words, the reliance on the draft international standard vote to approve, that can kind of reduce the impact of the comments that are submitted. On the other hand, if some of the comments are really, really excellent, right? They make a big improvement in the standard, and they make something of a change that was not in the draft international standard, then the working group could be persuaded, boy, this is really a change that's worth making. This comment is so persuasive and so helpful that we really think we need to include this. So on the other hand, sometimes the comments are so good and so significant that they can cause some changes to the standard that you would not expect once as a result of an approved DIS ballot. And this is further complicated by the fact that per the ISO directives, if a draft international standard ballot achieves certain favorable results, and there are some kind of tests in the directive that you have to meet. But if the draft international standard ballot is approved and meets certain thresholds, then the directives allow that draft international standard to go straight to publication with no further ballots and no further interaction with the national member committees. Now, that has to be in the situation where there are no technical changes that would be included to the DIS. So in all those conditions, right, the DIS that's balloted under certain conditions can go straight to publication. And in that scenario, in that particular scenario, and it's relatively common in ISO CASCO for that to happen. In that scenario, the CD ballot, the ballot we're on now, turns out to be really the only significant opportunity to influence the content of the standard. And so the CD ballot is important. As a matter of fact, you would kind of think the DIS ballot was more important because there's an actual vote to approve or disapprove. But in terms of really digging into the content of the standard and trying to get it, as clear and as consistent and as effective as possible, as it turns out, it's often the CD ballot that's the most critical. So at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Melanie, and then I believe we have time for some questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Vijay and Keith, for going through that information. It was a great presentation. While we give you time to enter your questions into the Q&A box, if you have any, we want to go over some additional resources that we have available for organizations in the credentialing space. ANAB has many different media to further your understanding of standards, accreditation, management systems, and assessments. On the ANAB website, we have some free webcasts on several different topics. The webcasts are about 5 to 20 minutes long, depending on the topic, and can be viewed at any time. We also have a blog page that Dr. Krishna mentioned with a wealth of information related to risk, accreditation, standards requirements, and many other topics. We also do our webinars monthly. We have another webinar coming up soon on the OSAC registry for forensics laboratories. And finally, we offer training in many different areas, including internal auditing, standards, risks, and many other topics. Most of our training is offered live online. We do offer in-person training as well. We have web-based self-paced training, and all of these resources can be found on the ANAB website at anab.ansi.org. Now we'll get to your questions. We did have a few questions come in that I answered while you all were speaking, and I learned something new about the official ISO languages of English, French, and Russian. But another question came out that asked, am I understanding correctly that at the earliest, the new set of standards would be published in January 2026?
Yeah, I'll take that one. Yes, that is the fastest path. That would, yes, it would be January 2026 at the earliest. That's if all the ballots line up and all the thresholds are met. There's no delay in the planned working group meetings. Right, January 2026.
Will the DIS comment period be posted in standards action?
Yes, as a matter of fact, the DIS ballots are posted in ANSI standards action. The CD ballots are not. So the one that we're having now, the CD ballot, you would not see that. ANSI standards action does not include notifications for CD ballots. But later, presumably, right, the first part of next year when the DIS ballot goes out, that will be in one of the published weekly versions of ANSI standards action.
Okay, then the next question is, how much time will an accredited CB have to implement the changes to the new standard if we are already using AI?
Okay, so I can respond to that. So if you are using AI, you can continue to use AI. So you don't have to wait till the standard is published. There are existing requirements in the current version of the standard that addresses things that I talked today, like fair, valid, and reliable, competence of personnel. So all of that. If you're doing it, you would need to have evidence to show that all of those are covered under the existing sort of requirements. In terms of the timelines for the new standard to be used, as Keith said, let's assume January 2026, the revised new standard comes out. And there would be a transition period that typically is determined by IAF, the International Accreditation Forum. In most cases, if the revisions are significant, it can be a 3-year transition period. If the changes are not significant, it could be 12 months. Now, what that essentially means is when the new standard is published, you would not have to straight away use or show compliance to the new standard the day it's published. You would have sufficient time to make the transition. ANAB puts out a transition plan based on IF resolution. And just like what we did in the past, we would help you to transition. Now, when the standard was revised last time, it was a significant challenge, especially for ABs and CBs outside of the United States in terms of some of the psychometric requirements, in terms of the development of the scheme. So it was a huge challenge. I don't personally anticipate that kind of challenge with this new version of the standard. At the same time, we would follow whatever timeline IF establishes, which essentially means the CBs that are accredited would have adequate time to make a transition, and you would still be accredited under 17024. And during that interim period, transition period, the CAPs would be accredited under the 2012 or the 2026 version of the standard. So I would not worry too much about that at this time, and I'm sure we're going to have added training on the new standards for each of the clauses that I talked today in terms of validation. What does that mean? And so we will put out resources to help CAP transition.
Okay, great. Someone else asked if the in a nutshell diagram or graphic that you had in your presentation, if that could be made publicly available.
I think this probably is a diagram that we have in the past included in the ANAB training workshops, because this is standard that Dr. Cynthia Woodley and I had developed it. So I think we can look, Melanie, how best we can make this available if we are making the webinar recordings and slides available, since this is something that we authored versus this is something coming out of ISO standard. So we can look in terms of how best we can share that with.
Okay, we can touch base about that offline. The next question is, will the standard differentiate between direct use of AI, such as in question development, and use of AI that is embedded in routine operations?
No. Doesn't matter how you use AI. It could be administrative matters, very routine things. But what would be important to look at, and I think probably the question looks at that, is like, hey, if I'm using AI for normal search response to a query, then do I need to follow these requirements? Like for instance, if you use an AI bot to respond to candidate questions, then what kind of evidence does that need to be validated? Has that to be fair? So I think some of these areas, it's not like a black and white situation. Certainly there are areas like exam development, exam writing, which is very heavily involved with how AI requirements are being written. But there could be other areas, more specifically in administrative areas, where some of these technologies get embedded in terms of how it's done. So at this time, the standard is not making a distinction, but we will look at it. And my best advice to you would be look at it in terms of risk and see if that really poses any specific risk to what you do using that for those activities that you're looking to do.
And I think this next question is very similar to the previous question. It says, as it is written now, is the disclosure to use AI a broad requirement regardless of how it is being used, or are there provisions for how the use of AI might impact the end user?
Yeah, I think like what this essentially would mean is, and we want to make sure that some of these technologies essentially are so embedded in what you do. Like for instance, if you're using an AI, say Google, or an AI that's embedded in a Google, I don't think you're going to put out a statement saying we are using AI for Google or for searches. So it's going to be, to my understanding, things that would really impact the competence part of it versus very routine administrative activities. So when you start looking at using AI for the scheme development, so if you look at the diagram that I had put out, so when you're looking at the scheme, the assessment, exam, that's where you have to be very cognizant of disclosure and acknowledgement versus the process issues and the activities issues, where it would not be touching directly, and it's not going to have the kind of impact in terms of assessing competence as opposed to exam, assessment, and scheme.
Excellent, thank you. Well, that is the last of the questions that I see in our Q&A box, and we are coming right up on the top of the hour, so that's perfect timing. We'll leave you with some contact information. If you had a question that you couldn't ask today, you can email those questions to either of the email addresses on this screen, and I will get them over to Dr. Krishna or to Keith. If you'd like additional information about training, you can email training@anab.org. Or if you're interested in accreditation services, you can email anab@anab.org. We really appreciate you attending this webinar, and I appreciate Dr. Krishna and Keith for being willing to present on the topic and provide such relevant information. We hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you.